Mediocre Rumble Brothers. Three, two, one.
All right, welcome to Mediocre Rumble Brothers. Today we'll be talking about sci-fi versus fantasy. We'll be sitting down and discussing our opinions on the different genres. But before we get started, make sure you subscribe on our channel, YouTube, as well as our Rumble. We'll go ahead and open the floor, and let's get started.
I'll take the reins. We can start easily enough by just saying just baseline. If someone just asked you, preference between sci-fi and the fantasy genre, whether it's video games, movies, books, whatever, which one pops into your mind first, or what's your favorite?
Probably fantasy for me.
It's definitely fantasy.
Yeah, I'm gonna say the same. I really don't have much on the sci-fi world.
It's funny because I would say sci-fi because I feel like and the thing is, I used to think the opposite, but I actually prefer sci-fi nowadays. Only because we'll get into it later, but I feel like fantasy is a very safe genre in the essence that I feel like a lot of creators don't take it far enough and only do what's kind of quote unquote expected of fantasy. But either way, I mean, expound on that. Just give give a brief explanation why fantasy is your go-to.
Well, it's funny. It's a little funny that you said you prefer sci-fi before the podcast you said you hate Star Wars.
Well, yeah, because Star Wars sucks, and that's a big. Well, I take it back. Pre-Disney Star Wars is pretty good, but Disney Star Wars is just Disney's destroyed Star Wars. And that's not because Star Wars is sci-fi. I'll get into my explanation after you guys tell me what yours is for fantasy. I'll tell you why I think that. So go ahead.
For fantasy, for me, I think it's just because the games I played and stuff growing up, a lot of them, topical as hell, but literally Final Fantasy was like a game. But Knights, Magic, Lord of the Rings, Hobbit, those kinds of things really kind of interest me. My dad played a lot of Might and Magic, Wizardry. There's a couple other ones, I guess. I can't remember what they're called right now. There's a lot of older, Ultimate.
Bane and the Cosmic Forge, Might and Magic.
Yeah,
Wizardry.
Those games they've kind of just been household names for me. So I've always been around fantasy, high fantasy and gothic horror fantasy stuff for a long time, and Magic and Knights are just super cool. And so I didn't really get introduced to a lot of sci-fi stuff as a kid outside of just typical Star Wars or whatever. But so whenever there was a genre of games for the longest time, if there was magic and it took place in a fantasy setting, I was immediately intrigued. A lot of JRPGs that I played are that way as well, unless of course it's like Star Ocean, but that kind of follows a Star Trek theme where you have the future guy lands on a underdeveloped planet that uses magic, and it takes place on the planet, so it's mostly fantasy, and then he's this stranger from another land kind of thing.
Right, go Edwin. How about you?
Yeah, I very much prefer the fantasy over sci-fi, specifically because, as Corey says, I like the knights, the magic, the literally in a fantasy world, anything can happen, whether it's something from reality or something just completely original. Because in a sci-fi setting, it has to at least be grounded in some sense of reality, which is just I play video games and things like that to escape from reality. I don't want to hear no shit about it. So it's I very much was more into not really into the Star Wars, not really into Alien, or I don't know if Predator counts as one, but I wasn't super interested in that, or the Terminator, RoboCop, things like that. I wanted I can't really even think about some right now, before Shrek and all that stuff. I prefer the fantasy stuff because things I'll never actually experience. So it's just it's more of the imaginative world. So it's just if someone were to create a fantasy in another world, it's so this you can really tell what that person is like by like how they create that type of world. So it's just like it's to each their own. It's like a lot more interesting to see someone make their own world like that in a fantasy as opposed to sci-fi.
It's funny because I think the opposite. But go ahead, Jordan. What about you?
Yeah, I'm so my side with fantasy is so everything starts off in the very bare minimum of how you can come with creation on how things are going to work, basically, because there's swords, arrows, the bare minimum, just the basic weaponry that you use. And I always enjoyed that because it could keep everything very simple. So when you're trying to make something come to life, it would not be too complex or difficult. Because, I mean, besides the Zelda, situation where you do time travel and stuff like that, that's kind of like the thing that usually comes in the mix with futuristic stuff. Sci-fi is usually built on space travel. It's based on high informants of technologies like your wormholes and all this kind of stuff where it's got to be extremely complex and it usually involves some sort of explanation, versus with fantasy it's usually just magic explains it all. It's super simple and easy to get around. But on the side note of that, I've been around that for a very long time, seeing all these types of old movies when I was a kid, to playing video games, and usually them being, if they were RPG, were usually related to fantasy, as it was that you would be swinging a sword, doing damage with your sword, your bow and arrows, maybe a robot here and there, depending if you're playing Chrono Trigger. But it's like it's very simple stuff, but it's been always been an easy way to create things, dragons, goblins, and all that stuff. And I've been very well versed with it. I don't say that I completely take sci-fi off the table. Mass Effect was a great series.
No. Yeah, that's not the question we're asking. Obviously, it's I was just like, what side of the camp are on? You're not allowed to play sci-fi anymore because you like fantasy.
Yeah, but I just side with that side more easier, just because again it was just a lot more things that I've been around for quite some time, and again just the simplistic way of how things formulate together. Where again the sci-fi side, it's a lot more complex, and it's, in my opinion, easy to destroy if you do not make sense of what you're doing, versus back then it was, fantasy is just you use the magic and that explains everything. With, if you were to say magic in the future, you'd kind of be asking what you're doing to be able to get from here to there. If it's dealing with aliens and such, they usually tend to have more detail on it. So it's like that's kind of where I'm at with the whole sci-fi and the fantasy side.
It's funny because I'm hearing a lot of what I would say, but in the reverse. So when I say fantasy, to me is like very safe. It's like I see too many fantasy games with all the same tropes in them. And I'm not saying sci-fi is completely, immune to this either. But the thing about fantasy is that when you think about it on a baseline, of course, it's a spectrum. We're not, every sci-fi and fantasy game isn't going to fit all these. There's variations and everything. But when you think about fantasy, it's like, well, great. We have magic. We have knights. We have elves. We have dwarves. We have, orcs and goblins and all that shit. Wizards and warlocks and whatever. Dragons, stuff like that. But it's like, that's almost the problem. It's like when I see all those it's like, when you see a dwarf, it's like, yep, dwarfs they're short, stout, they're strong, they're miners, they build stuff for their, but it's like that across the board. Elves are very light, they're very, greater than thou, they like nature and stuff like that. They're archers, whatever, they're very graceful. And I just feel like I see 100 million iterations of that through a ton of fantasy. And color by numbers, like people just do that too much with their fantasy to the point where everything starts looking the same to me. Again, you have variations here and there, but the thing is with sci-fi, there's no like paint by numbers for aliens, because aliens can be anything. There is no set alien race unless you're going to count like maybe gray aliens, how we interpret them, in UFO culture. But like, I just feel like there's more creative like potential out of the box with sci-fi than it is with fantasy. And of course they even cross over multiple times too, because you have Mass Effect with biotics, and that's basically just their way to justify space magic, but they justify it in the sense that it's basically mental brainwaves manipulating dark matter. But the other thing is that like I feel like people play too fast and loose with the fantasy. What I like about sci-fi is that stuff is usually governed by rules most of the time, and that's what I like in my worlds. I don't like the whole like, how did that happen? Magic shrugs. It's like, well, I like magic having rules, even if it is magic, because it means there's stakes. If magic can just do anything, then that's just lame. Because it just, you can just do anything and you don't have to explain anything. You don't have to do any legwork for your story. Magic, it's like boom, magic. I don't have to explain anything. Whereas sci-fi, because it's based, in science fiction, they typically are reaching more to explain how something works and are thus more beholden to rules. Again, this is just generally speaking, but even like Warhammer 40K does its best to explain all its nonsense, and they have what you would qualify as space magic in the chaos and warp energies of psychers and stuff like that. But again, they justify it by basically being this like otherworldly dimension of demons parallel to our own. But I just feel like there's higher highs in the creative processes of science fiction, just more being able to create stuff, because there's nothing like Krogan, there's nothing like Turians, there's nothing like the Tyranids. I mean, even Warhammer 40K makes space orcs, but like they're not like normal orcs. Like they generally made space orcs. It's like it's not the same. I think that's why I was drawn to World of Warcraft so much, because World of Warcraft kind of like defied a lot of typical fantasy conventions, because the orcs weren't just bloodthirsty killers. They were cultured. They were shamanistic, but they were tricked by demons into becoming evil and then broke away from them. And you have goblins and stuff walking around like normal people. They're just not evil creatures. Like every race had like their own intelligent thing going on. Like the Minotaurs were like Native Americans, the Tauren. They weren't just bloodthirsty creatures. That's why I was drawn to World of Warcraft, because of how much they defied a typical fantasy setting, especially with what most people would consider evil races had like more going on for them. And that's not saying it's a bad thing. Lord of the Rings is a very cut and dry like good versus bad story, but Lord of the Rings is the exception, not the rule. And with Lord of the Rings, magic is very limited. It is only for wizards basically and elves, and it is very hard to do and does not just magically whisk them away at any situation. So that's why Lord of the Rings is cool, because that world actually has stakes and rules in that terms, but that's because Tolkien took so much time and effort creating his entire world. But that would be my defense for why I like sci-fi better, because I just feel like I do like fantasy stuff, like don't get me wrong, but even if I'm going to draw it back to just video games, growing up, played lots of Battlefront. I loved Star Wars as a kid. Right now, I'm kind of whatever about it. I like old Star Wars. Fuck whatever Disney does. But I played shit tons of Star Wars as a kid. I love robots. Robots are cool. And opposite to Edwin, I loved Terminator as a kid, loved Alien, loved Predator. I like sci-fi movies. And even like, if you're going to ask me what my most preferred genre is, we're taking to like, very polar opposite ends of this discussion, but I like more modern day settings with more sci-fi aspects to them, which I would qualify into like something like, I don't know, cyberpunk. Obviously, it's still far future, but it's more down to earth than like spacefaring stuff constantly, so
because you want to see something that could happen at any day.
Kind of, sorta. It's like I feel. It's like I can see. Yeah. It's like even if I'm long dead by the time it happens, sci-fi is almost imagination of what the future could be like. And again, I love fantasy as much as the next guy, but it's just like I feel like I have more potential in seeing something unique and creative with sci-fi than I would with any regular fantasy thing. The last like really creative fantasy world that I love, and it was this book series called Xanth. And I love that book series, and they did really cool and funny stuff with magic, in terms of like everything is a pun. Everyone's born with like a magical talent that's super varied. It's just it's a fun book for anyone who wants to look it up. It's a really old book, written by Piers Anthony. Really, really cool book series.
Question.
Yes.
So again, as you're talking about with the whole sci-fi, and that you like that they have rules involved with how everything is going to play together, so it seems more optimal, makes more reason, and makes more sense. Do you think that that's possible? That can also be kind of not say the downfall, but that can also be kind of a challenge for creators, that when they're trying to make these video games, as you can see, there's a saturation of fantasy versus sci-fi, that if you're trying to make a very good game for sci-fi, it does require a lot more extra work involving story base to make sense of what they're going to do versus them pumping out another fantasy game. Do you see that possibly being, because I don't see a lot of futuristic games compared to the adventure, which we've already said about, with the fantasy being very simple, very easy, versus with sci-fi. The cyberpunk, I'm sure, was a lot of science involved in explaining what they're doing. The Mass Effect, like we're talking about the relays and everything, how they made everything work, made a great storyline, but there was a lot of other things involved to tell how this all came to be versus playing an old game or something that's just that's regular, just fantasy, where again they don't have to come up with too much information to explain what's going on, except for just that the good versus the evil kind of thing.
Yeah, because it does involve more legwork, and that's why, right? When you're jumping into fantasy, you can just play it safe, and my elves are tree people, dwarves are dirty mountain people, humans are just whatever. They're tenacious, they're adaptable. Every fucking fantasy thing does that. Goblins, orcs are evil, period, and just move forward with that. And then, again, because some people can just do the magic, some people like Tolkien, do the legwork and kind of like restrict their magic, but some people are like, yeah, it's magic, I don't gotta explain shit. But at the same time, I don't even think people take advantage of the I don't got to explain shit. So if you don't have to explain anything, bro, the sky's the limit. Like, make some crazy fucking magic for me to play with. This is kind of why no, go ahead.
I was gonna say, like, that the I don't need to explain shit completely can be applied to Dune.
Oh well, I don't know. Unfortunately, I can't speak to Dune. I don't know anything about Dune.
Like,
so
when you're
I know
watching,
that's a sci-fi franchise. But...
yeah, Arrakis, all this. It's just kind of like, what the fuck is going on? But it's just so crazy, and you're just on board with it.
Well, it's like like with
it's not
sci-fi,
important enough, right?
They can sci-fi still makes up their own nonsense in terms, but like here's a thing that only exists in our universe. It's fucking unobtainium or some bullshit like that.
Yeah.
And it's like, so with this, but with this thing does this, so we can do this with this, and that lets us do this, right? And that's what we call techno jargon in sci-fi, right? That's their bullshit explanation, but it's still an explanation. Yeah. And whereas magic, most people just say shrug it, shrug magic, who cares? But when I going back to what I was saying, that's why I was disappointed in stuff like Skyrim or the magic system specifically, in the Elder Scrolls, or not even just Skyrim, because Oblivion did it better. Skyrim and other fantasy stuff. It's like, oh boy, magic, the sky's the limit. What can I do? It's like throw fire, lightning, ice, and that's about it. It's like, well, cool. You really thought about that for 5 whole seconds, didn't you? You just took the same fucking 5 spells that every fantasy thing uses, and I get to do that? Wow, great. I'm so happy. That's why it's like, when I played something like Dragon Age Origins, it's so cool. There's even a shape-shifting class you can spec into. That's fucking cool. Like, even something Necromancer, I would still consider something to be pretty vanilla, but you don't see very often. It's always fire, ice, lightning, or wind sometimes if you're lucky. Like, magic is just, if you don't have to explain anything, go fucking nuts, dude. Do crazy shit. Like, it's magic. If you're not gonna bother explaining anything, at least make it fun. Like, I don't know what to tell you. Like, I feel like sci-fi authors put more effort into making cool sci-fi guns than fantasy writers do making cool fantasy spells that no one's seen before. And I'm not trying to say everything has to be original. Nothing's original. I'm not saying, oh, you can't have fireball in your fantasy thing, but do other stuff with fire. What about firestorm, or like a heat wave, or something more subtle magic, or something like that. Something that I like about Overlord, the anime, is that Ainz has so much magic that can do so many things. Like, he can do so much shit with his magic. Like, he has myriads of spells. Like, the dude really made this giant spell list for the guy that's way beyond just fire, ice, and lightning. He still has them, but he has so many spells past that. Like, one cool spell that he does when he just wants to win, he's just grasp heart, which just lets you grab the enemy's heart and crush it in your hands psychically from a distance. That's fucking cool. Overpowered, granted, but that's all. That's kind of the point. But it's fucking cool. I've never seen anything like that in another fantasy setting. Whereas
that's the problem with the magic. The sky's the limit. It was cool. So if the sky's the limit, how do you power scale all this shit? Because even in Dragon Ball, it's just it's hey, we're gods, but these other people from different dimensions can still put up with us even though they're not on exactly a god level like Goku and Vegeta. But it's like also it's just like, hey, it was like we want to destroy Earth. Let's fight Goku and Vegeta instead, and instead of actually like blowing up the Earth because those fuckers can't breathe in space. I could just do that, but instead I'm gonna just fight them and then blow up the Earth when I can just kill them super easily along with everyone else.
Yeah, but I
So
think
it's
that's a problem. But that's exactly what I'm saying, right?
Yeah.
Because they're almost like it's almost like a circular problem. You don't want to explain anything, but you still can't go too crazy. But you don't want to. But you don't want to have. But in order to go crazy, you need rules, and in order to have rules, you can't. You have to explain something. You
Right.
know, that's like this like cyclical problem that the magic system in fantasy typically has with me. And so if you don't bother explaining anything, just sky's the limit. And Ainz in Overlord is a very specific example. The point of that story is that he's completely overpowered. He's the only one in that world that has those kinds of spells, at least as of right now. But that's the point of the story. I'm using him more as an example of like an author creating crazy spells that I've never seen in another fantasy setting before.
Well, I would say that for what Jordan's asking, that like sci-fi isn't necessarily like harder to create a good story than fantasy. It just kind of depends on the creativity of the writer that has like this setting they're assigned, because you can still make fantasy. It's just the over usage of fantasy with its almost like by the numbers like examples that are pre like drilled into everybody's head, like gothic horror or anything like that. You're just gargoyle. There's almost like a list of creatures in every fantasy, but because aliens can be anything, it does take some more creativity, but you can still apply that same creativity to create your own sci-fi universe, to create your own fantasy universe. It's just, I think
Oh yeah,
people can be
it just
lazier with
yeah, it
when
just
they
happens
choose
less
fantasy.
often.
Yeah,
That's my
'cause-
point. That's exactly
yeah.
my point.
Well, I mean, yeah,
Because it's like
yeah. Sorry, because I was going to say, like, because the huge one that usually comes into being a very huge conflict, if it's said on, is just if it's not handled properly, is time travel, right? I mean, if something does not
Yeah.
make sense of how it works and you fuck it up, it's a huge fuck up, because if there's people behind it and they understand how this shit really works, they understand exactly the rules and how this thing actually operates, and you don't play by the rules exactly, it can end up becoming a huge downfall, and that's what can destroy a lot of things. And I know that usually futuristic, or at least on its way to futuristic ways, they will sometimes tie that in. And again, you have to be extremely careful with it, versus other things where everything's in the past. You don't really have that set to happen because everything's already back then. So you can fuck with whatever you want to do, and it doesn't need to really make sense. Besides, if it's going way back into dinosaur ages and all that shit, then there might be a little bit more difference, because if you got paleontologists and shit, that'll prove you wrong. But if you're like in the middle area where it's a safe zone, you can do and say whatever you want, and it's not really much of an issue. Versus futuristic wise, you have a lot of technologies and things that either that's like today standards that we know, you have to make sure that you're not blowing it out of proportion. So you got to be kind of more careful.
I think the story flow too kind of really depends on the medium that they're applying it to. Because if you were to say, like, I think that a sci-fi movie is going to cost you more than a fantasy movie. But if you
you
both
could
are
slap
writing,
some pointy ears on someone and call them an
yeah,
elf. Like
yeah, if you're applying like sci-fi
yeah.
and fantasy to writing a novel, it's going to come down to the writer's ability to kind of make an expansive world in their own mind, or if they want to just write, here's something everybody kind of already knows. And then if you go with video games, I think a fantasy video game and a sci-fi video game are going to apply equal amounts of effort for visuals and everything else. But when it comes to writing the quest lines or stories, if they do the Elder Scrolls route, where they also have the by the books creatures, even though they kind of have their own visual spin on it. But
well,
there's
kind of,
vampires,
sort of.
there's
It's
vampires
like
and werewolves, and it's still kind of simple. Whereas you approach, Mass Effect, I've never seen any of these creatures before because they had to make everything up. So I think that it is it really depends on if you're the writer's going to be. There is, I guess, 60-40 in a sense of like sci-fi to fantasy writing on like a difficulty scale.
That's
And,
like you can be lazy with the fantasy and just say it's magic, or it's just like the power scale. It's like, oh, friendship because my magic is based on love or something like that. But like for sci-fi, it was like most people would try and like base it off something in reality. So a lot of it would take a lot of research. At least that's something that I would do. Whereas it's like I have to explain how the pyramids of Egypt are actually transformers and how no one in history ever figured that out beforehand when I made this movie.
I'm Michael Bay, and I make too much
Yeah.
money, so I don't have to give a fuck.
To be fair though, it's like as an audience member, like I don't give a how like if like people discovered that these weren't pyramids or like and they were actually transformers. Like some information is just kind of like I don't care. Because
I'm gonna hard disagree with you there because that's just fucking retarded.
well, no, I
I'm
mean
sorry.
obviously like that the story of Transformers movies is just kind of like womp womp, and it's mainly just visual effects like the movie, but some stuff where it's like I don't really care about certain like space travel, I guess, in the Dune movies where they don't really talk about it too much, but in the books they go into a lot of detail. And I guess if you're talking about books versus like the film adaptations, but I feel like that's its own conversation in general. But like Final Fantasy's magic system, it's kind of like in Final Fantasy VI. They draw the magic energy from the creatures that they found in this like other dimension or I guess realm or something like that, and they drain their energies to use magic and apply them to humans. And that's kind of neat. But then you could also go the route of, well, the magic energy comes from the planet, and it's like, oh, I've seen that before. It really kind of depends on how deep the person would like to apply that. But I don't, depending on if it's important to me as like the audience member, like if it's never important enough for them to actually explain how something works, that I can just be on board with it because it's the world that it's in. Like if it's like taking place and I don't ever have to question like why, like the logistics of building a Death Star kind of thing. It's like, well, where'd they get all the materials? It's like I don't need to be in the boardroom.
Well, no,
Yeah,
that makes sense though. But no,
Yeah.
no, no. Here's the thing though. That makes sense. The Empire rules the galaxy. They can just take that resource from wherever they feel like. Like them
Yeah.
building the Death Star. Yeah, logistically, holy fuck, is that an effort? But like, it's possible. Like I don't need to explain how they, what planets requisition what resources and how they transported it all there. Like I can believe that. Like yeah, some things are left unsaid. And if we're going to bring it back to dumbass Transformers, the point I'm trying to make with that specifically is that in the first movie, Optimus is like, oh, yes, this is the first time we're on Earth. It's like, never mind, it was back in Egyptian days. Never mind, it was back when King Arthur was the thing or some bullshit like that. It's like, it's retconning their own nonsense.
That's a commercial like writing problem with the people that are developing that product. If you were to look at it as like the one movie, the first one, then it'd be like, oh, I'm on board with this. But then when they keep doing these other ones, and it's like, wait a second, have you guys even watched your previous content? Do you know what you're making?
And even then with the Egyptian thing, it's like, let's just say that that is the only problem, right? It's like I still have a problem if you're not going to bother explaining how we didn't know they were Transformers, unless you can just put in a throwaway line of just like, oh yes, but we actually built a real pyramid over the fake pyramid, so you never found out, or some stupid bullshit like that. That's all I need.
Device or some insert.
Yeah, it's some sci-fi sci-fi and techno jargon, which on a surface level might not have basis in science fiction, but in this world that's a thing. So it's like, oh, okay, cool. But when you have like, I don't know, it's not like I need everything explained. It's just more like if you're going to introduce something to me, and more often than not it happens with magic, like if like something, like I look at Harry Potter stuff, and when you see stuff like you can just cast a spell and fucking dishes do themselves, I'm just like, why is there anything such as problems in this universe? Like you could just have shit do it, like clean itself, do things, chores for you, and like how do you people have any problems at all?
Yeah, I was gonna bring up Harry Potter because like when you said like the realistic and like an actual set limit on the magic, Harry Potter came to mind because most of the spells that they have in those movies is like more practical usage, but also they have like those charms that's like, oh, as long as you know the words, anyone can do them, and then there's not really a restrictive thing. It's just like they just tell you don't do this, but you can't stop me from saying the words because I already know the words.
But I think Harry Potter's that is the law, right? It's the moral law.
the Harry Potter, my problem with that is just like they introduce all this magic, and yes, it seems to be limited in its capacity, but the problem with Harry Potter is just like, I'm Harry and I'm in a problem. I will not use magic ever. It's like, just dude, wave your fucking wand, do something. It's magic,
There's
my
very,
man.
very little magic in a magic movie.
Yeah, that's its problem. It's the problem of giving your characters the capacity to do something, and they just don't do it for no fucking reason at all. So I mean, like, because
I think
I have a
for
hard
me,
time. Oh, here's an example. Sorry, before this thought escapes me again. The latest fantasy world that I really thought was interesting, and it wasn't even because it was like super far away from something I haven't seen before, was actually Visions of Mana, because I was like, oh, I like the tailed. I haven't seen something like that in a fantasy world. They're just people with animal tails and ears. It's a different race, but that's interesting. Or the plant people that like there's only one person active at a time, and the other ones are all in like hibernation. I'm like, oh, that's neat. I haven't seen an ent like plant person like this in a fantasy setting before, and how their magic system works was more or less limited by all the the elemental spirits and stuff like that, and sacrificing people at the mana tree, right? So I'm
the
like,
murder tree.
I was really into it. I think the only thing that was like disconnected for that world for me was all the weird ass monster designs, and I was questioning how some of them had like clothes and stuff. I'm like, do we talk to these people? Or we just murder them indiscriminately. That was like the only thing I was off about it for me. But like overall, I was like, oh, this is a kind of unique-ish take on a fantasy world I haven't seen yet. And I mean, I don't know how much of that was borrowed from Final Fantasy, where it came from, but I was like, oh, this is pretty unique. I like this. I was like super into it. I liked it.
I have similar questions about Dragon Quest.
Yeah.
There's like weird monster designs. Like why? Like some of these are people under like bed sheets, and it's like they're just called poltergeists. It's like,
To be fair,
okay.
if there was a guy who showed up in my house under a bedsheet, I probably would also battle him.
Yeah.
Yeah, but there's like some other questionable stuff. It was like this is like,
but that just
man-made
goes back to the
stuff.
point of just like it's fantasy. I don't have to explain anything. They're magical creatures. Whatever. Fuck you. It's
I
like
mean,
we
I
don't have to
like
explain
the
anything.
art style of Toriyama and the Dragon Quest series.
Oh yeah.
I like the Dragon Quest universe because for me, like when you look at like classic Final Fantasy was literally like castles and airships and dragons, but then it
I feel like
eventually
that's
turned
all like
into
basic staples.
it turned into
for anyone
steampunk.
to use.
And around Final Fantasy, Final Fantasy 7 was steampunk. They did steampunk though in Final Fantasy 6 as well. But it still maintained a lot of that high fantasy because there was like Figaro Castle, except for its emergency evacuation technique is to burrow itself in the sand and relocate somewhere else in the desert so people can't find it, which is kind of cool. But then you have Magitech armor, and it's like, okay, but it works in that setting. And then you have Final Fantasy 7, which is like a super corporation that's like polluting everything, and now we're going steampunk and everybody has guns except for all of your characters minus Barrett, who has a gun for a hand. So it's
And yeah, fantasy dips its toes into sci-fi sometimes, or like more sci-fi-ish elements, and the reverse happens too. Because like I think something that is lost in sci-fi settings a lot is the lack of close combat play, right? Because sci-fi, future guns, so people
Right.
are going to be using guns a lot, and it's almost like, and Mass Effect actually had this problem where there was like virtually no close quarters combat, and basically if it came down to it, the only reason you were in close quarters combat is because the Krogan didn't give a shit about what you were doing and came to like cave your skull in.
That shit was
But then
annoying.
like in Mass Effect 3, they're like, the Omni Blade, because we need some kind of melee weapon now, because everyone else is doing it. And even
this is
Halo,
cool as hell.
yeah, and Halo kind of dabbled in it too. And even in the first Halo, the elites have energy swords, and they gave you the grav hammer. They gave elements of melee, but then you have stuff like Warhammer 40K, which leans heavily into the fact that there's like an equal part of like shooty gunplay, and then you have chain swords, power fists. Like there's so much melee combat in 40K, even though there's tons of world-ending guns you can just carry around with you. But clearly they were trying to appease both sides there. Whereas in fantasy, you usually have the opposite problem. It's like there's lots of close quarters combat with sword play and axes and stuff like that. And then the most ranged battle you're going to get is usually with bows and occasional spell
one
flinging.
wizard on your
Usually,
team.
yeah.
And
I think
oh, go ahead. Sorry.
I was going to say something that's kind of unique or interesting, I guess, to me, like when reflecting back on like fantasy story, like arcs and sci-fi story arcs, is fantasy story arcs tend to kind of gravitate towards like this relic from beyond that can grant us great power, whereas the sci-fi element is this relic of the past that can help us with the future.
Yeah. Yeah,
I've seen that a
I
lot
could probably
played out.
see that. Yeah. Mhm.
or something that shows up from deep space that we never explored before that somehow allows us to explore such deep space.
Yeah, no, that's no. I guess I never thought about that. That is kind of a thing that happens a lot of the time. Again, not as a rule, but yeah, that's common
Yeah.
enough.
Yeah, but I agree with the fantasy part where it's like a lot of things are pretty samey, but it's just like I more or less the same can happen with sci-fi. It's just like how much effort
Oh,
you're willing to
it
put in and
can.
how much you are
Yeah.
willing to explain. But the fantasy stuff was like I agree with considering with how much fucking isekai genres
Yeah,
there are.
Jesus.
It's like really fucking annoying. It's like just stop, just come up with something else. But
Well,
like a lot of I like fantasy is like usually around like the King Arthur type of era, medieval um, like aspects to it. But like all the
yeah.
other stuff like probably comes in from Dungeons and Dragons, like the type of enemies that you would find because that thing is like insanely popular as well as Warhammer.
Hmm. Well, it's like I mean, sci-fi still has its tropes. I was using the extreme example of the aliens not having like a trope, but you know what's the sci-fi trope that everyone usually goes to?
Always
Super
attack
soldiers.
America and none of the rest of the world.
Yeah.
Well,
the
it's
really
always
weird-
super soldiers is an easy one to target sci-fi for, right? Because Halo, Master Chief,
Yeah.
Mass Effect, technically the N7/Spectres. They're not quite super soldiers, but they might as well be. And then obviously you have
Doom.
Warhammer for. Did you say Dune or Doom?
Does Doom count? Isn't that guy like a super soldier, or is that not?
Yeah, sort. Doom is in a weird place in it, but yeah, I mean, Doom is more of a sci-fi franchise, but he's more like they gave him more lore in the new games, but Doom guy is just Doom guy. He's just practically a fucking god in and of himself. Like he's unique in a sense. But then you have Warhammer 40K with the Space Marines, and they're literally like they made knights but futuristic sci-fi, and they're the iconic super soldiers of sci-fi. But yeah, super soldier in itself is a trope, just as like all the standard fantasy races are that of the other thing.
Well,
And I think
yeah.
Corey, you said earlier, like as far as storylines go, I think the more point I'm trying to make here is that like the worlds that are constructed around these things are they're more varied in sci-fi than they are in fantasy. You can still write a good fantasy story with a world that's just kind of like stock standard fantasy, right? Whatever. It's not really storytelling I'm getting at. It's more like just like the world building and creating like a cool environment. And as far as the isekai thing goes, Edwin, it's almost you're kind of on the nose. Those are more just like they created this. That's almost like a difference. Is that like usually the stories in the stupid isekai animes are different enough, but it's the problem with like the storytelling. It's always like a character that's overpowered for no fucking reason, and he's just like a god in the new world and can do whatever he wants. I think it's like unlike Overlord, where that's kind of like the point of the show and the story, where they're making it a whole plot point that's actually more or less a problem, and he's the bad guy of that world. And when Konosuba is the odd one out, where Kazuma is basically fucking powerless in this entire world, and he's just kind of a fucking loser.
Yeah.
And then like slime, like reincarnated as a slime, is all right. Like it's straddling the middle ground of being boring to like doing its own thing. He's not a god in that world, but he's still very powerful. Whereas like all the other isekais are like taking the wrong lessons from the good ones and they all end up being in the same like sludge blender of like uninteresting stories and characters. So
The one that I can definitely say that also helps sci-fi is, I don't know how recent it is because I wasn't really informed of it until you told me about it, which was I can't remember the acronym, but the contain, protect, or whatever that.
SCP.
Yes,
yeah, SCP.
like that is a huge win for sci-fi in my opinion because that opens up the floor for so much other possibilities of things that can be considered creative to help gather more information, make things more available to help out sci-fi in regard to you were doing aliens, time travel and stuff. Well, now there's these other things, these wormholes, these doors that have opened up and now have released this new kind of creature that is just destructive and needs to be contained in some sort of way as it's doing some sort of damage to the populace. It's really cool to see that, and that also again gives you so much different types of storylines to play with, and I think that also gives them a lot more ability to be able to do things. It's the same as like what fantasy does, where they kind of have a little bit more wiggle room to do things as they will.
It's like SCP is just like a collaboration of an entire community to like make up to make up literally anything from absolutely nothing, or like the most insignificant thing in a real world object, or
Right,
just
but
like some kind of psychology.
right, and that way this is kind of like the same thing, which where Udon was talking about. Like we have just dragons, we have just orcs, and this things and that. I mean, they can have the same exact thing on their side, where the door opens and
Inventive.
then yeah, and then you just have endless possibilities because there is no real rule to what is coming out that door. It's all up to creativity. Whatever your mind says is what works, as long as again as it kind of fits into play with whatever your world is surrounded in. You're trying to make sense of it to work through that. But again, when it comes to that door, it could be anything, and that's really cool.
That's what I like about
Yes.
cosmic horror, honestly, is like cosmic horror has that same approach where it could just be anything. And just because the word cosmic is in there doesn't necessarily mean that it's, sci-fi. It could be
Well,
an elder god.
it's taking the same advantages as sci-fi though. There is no rules for what a cosmic horror is. Like a cosmic horror, like by definition, is like an unknowable entity. We don't know anything about it. Whereas like a lot of things about fantasy stuff because there's kind of more or less preset rules. There's so many examples to go by that are all more or less the same. I think one example, like a couple other more small examples of like fantasy stuff that I like that are different. I don't know anyone here's played Divinity, which is what the people who did Baldur's Gate did before they did Baldur's Gate 3 and
Original Sin or whatever.
yeah, but in Divinity, I don't like how they look, but their lore for how their elves work is really weird. I've never seen elves like they have it because their elves are they're not beautiful. They're kind of ugly, actually, especially their bodies. They're warped and twisted, but it's supposed to resemble tree bark. They're also very tall and very lanky. Like they're almost like horror creatures in a way. And they have an ability to like, if they eat a piece of a dead body, they can like recall memories of the dead body. Like it's such a weird, unique take on elves. That I really liked it. They were really creepy and weird. I never played as one. I liked the lizard men. They were cooler, but like it's just like, oh, that's a unique take on an elf I haven't seen before.
It reminds me of Guado, the like weird plant people in Final Fantasy X.
And then like an opposite, and here's an example of sci-fi almost taking advantage of what is set in fantasy but making it more interesting is Deep Rock Galactic. They literally just took dwarves that are usually minors in fantasy. It's like, well, what if we throw them in sci-fi? And because there's no rules for that, they made a whole unique like little world for them in that game with all the different kinds of guns and all the different fucking fighting space bugs in a giant sci-fi mine with guns and shit as dwarves. That's super cool.
I think something that's interesting with sci-fi is that you tend to see more like one-off short stories that can focus around one thing specifically, and like it's kind of harder to find that in like a fantasy without them needing to do like some sort of epic journey.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like the sci-fi is like more limited to how or where it takes place because most of the time it's like here on Earth with humans. But you can just like go somewhere out in space and then introduce humans as like a secondary creature. So if you start off with like a completely different alien, then you can like make your like in a fantasy you could in a fantasy setting, you could just make an entirely new race with like weird magic or anything like that. And it was like that's but it's out in space, so like you don't really have to explain that by realistic logic because it's like somewhere out that we never explored before. It was like anything could be out there.
Well, doesn't RoboCop take place in Detroit?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I know what Edwin's saying.
That's like the kind of limited thing.
What Edwin's saying is right. I actually haven't really thought about that, but yes, a lot of sci-fi still has Earth and like what we know as modern day Earth as like the catalyst for what the sci-fi universe grew out of. Essentially, like we are the past and this is the future sort of thing. Very few sci-fi universes I think don't do that. Like weirdly enough, something like oddly enough, Gears of War. Gears of War is technically sci-fi if we're really gonna like put a label on it. But that's not Earth. That's called Sarah. Like nothing about Gears of War is supposed to resemble our world, even though there's tons of similarities. But that's a weird example of like that not being Earth at all. But again, stuff like Star Trek, fucking Mass Effect, even Warhammer. Warhammer uses different names for stuff. Like they don't call it Earth, they call it Terra. And like everything that we know about modern day civilization just uses slightly warped names, but it's Earth. That's we're not kidding around here. It's Earth. One of the what? You're breaking up.
Break it up, Charlie.
You're going through a tunnel.
Oh,
He's
Okay.
dying.
All right.
Someone help him. You're still dying.
Phoenix down.
jump out and jump back in.
Yeah.
I think the only other thing I was going to say, weirdly enough, Star Wars is actually one of the ones that doesn't do that because it's in a galaxy far, far away. There's nothing to do with Earth or anything. Everything about Star Wars is planets, and everything about that just like completely original. That has nothing to do with Earth or anything.
Yeah, it's a very weird like setting for that, anyways, because it's like what, a long time ago and far, far away. So it's like, well, when is this?
Yeah. Well, but the thing is that specifically is not important. We're just in a different
Yeah.
part of the galaxy. That's a good example of something that doesn't need to be explained. It doesn't matter. It's just somewhere far out in the galaxy we'll never see before.
People
All this
live out
crazy shit's
here.
happening. Yeah.
People live out here, shit's going on, and that's all you need to know.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's funny because like sci-fi being limited to like small locations to grandiose like locations of sailing across the cosmos to Elysium, where it's like poor people are stuck on the surface of Earth, and this place named Elysium is where all the rich folks are that have like the cure for every disease. Kind of just do anything, right? Chappie. That's sci-fi. Detroit Detroit Become Human, obviously. That's like surrogate type of sci-fi story.
Yeah, that's what I was explaining. I actually prefer the sci-fi, but closer to modern day than spacefaring a lot of the time, which is how I would describe the Fate franchise. Fate's a weird one where it blends sci-fi and fantasy really well, but it's all takes place in modern day more or less. But there's too many sci-fi aspects for it to not be classified as that really.
Mankind Divided and Human Revolution, those two games are really cool, and that's cyberpunk, right? Like it takes place in like Prague and Detroit and China, and but you're running around with augmented robot parts and stuff. So it's like, this is really cool because it's like I can see it.
That's what I'm saying. Like like cyberpunk is a genre of itself, but it's still under the umbrella. It's like a subgenre of sci-fi, but in the same aspect, we don't like cyberpunk doesn't have rules. So seeing everyone's interpretation of what cyberpunk world is like Shadowrun doesn't look like Cyberpunk 2077, right? And Shadowrun's a weird one because they were also trying to like incorporate fantasy stuff into a sci-fi setting or a cyberpunk-ish setting
for sure.
But like there's still more varied and more interesting worlds within that than there is in like the mire of a bunch of fantasy stuff. Like granted, obviously the fantasy ones that do it differently stand out. Like Elder Scrolls does have good things about it that makes it stand out from other fantasies. I was specifically picking on the magic system in gameplay wise. But like Elder Scrolls is like bonus is the fact that everyone's civilized. Like the elves are kind of out of the woods. Like it's almost like after the fantasy happens, like now everything's in a more civilized kind of place. Is how Elder Scrolls works, which is kind of interesting. Let's see.
Like
Dragon Age is
genres for each one. So it's like if they really wanted to keep the original idea of a creature, they would just make a subcategory and then just make them the way they want them to be. Like there's the different elves in Skyrim, like the wood elves, they're like the hunters, and they actually live like the regular forest people. And then you have do the Thalmor even count? Because like underground creatures.
No, they do
Yeah,
because they were from elves. So
yeah, so it's just like there's like you can have the original idea or you can twist it up. So it's just like
like Elder Scrolls had stuff going for it. I was just picking on Elder Scrolls like magic system specifically because it was easy to point at and be like. And what I meant by, I don't think I clarified this earlier, but what I meant by Oblivion did it better is that Oblivion, I don't know if they brought this back in the remaster. I hope they did. You could make spells, so you could combine a bunch of crazy stuff. And obviously there are smaller things to Elder Scrolls magic system. I don't want to pretend like I'm willfully ignoring them, but like yes, there is like Charm Person or like. There is one unique spell in Skyrim where you can transmute stuff into gold. It's not very useful, but it's something like that's different.
Mm-hmm.
And so like, and being able to like telekinesis and stuff like there is some small variations, but a lot of the ones that aren't that, or what a lot of those like niche ones aren't very useful in the game. And it's like, I want magic to damage people. I have like 3 elemental options and that's it. Or
that's
you
where
can
mods
maybe
come in.
But that's what I'm saying is like mods take advantage of the fact it's like, oh, let's make actual cool spells that were like a bunch of crazy shit can go in, right? But when Bethesda was making Skyrim, it's like fire, ice, lightning. That's all you get. It's like cool. This is lame. Whereas like Oblivion, you had a little bit of wiggle room with the spell creation system. So yes, you're still limited by those elements, but you can make them do different things in different ways. So it felt different at least. But that was just a problem with like a lot of fantasy magic systems to me was just the lack of, if you're going to use magic and you're not even going to bother making too many rules for it, like make some crazy shit.
Yeah,
I want to see something creative.
yeah. But before I cut out, I was trying to ask her like, where in the sci-fi and fantasy does Borderlands lead?
Sci-fi,
That's sci-fi for sure.
because it's on a different planet. I don't actually know if Earth is a thing in the Borderlands universe. I actually don't know. That's a good question, but it's definitely sci-fi regardless. Yeah, I mean, and again, Borderlands isn't quite like anything you've seen before, really. I mean, it's more like, I guess if you really wanted to be pedantic about it, you can say it's Tatooine turned up to fucking 11, I guess. But
yeah, dystopian sci-fi.
yeah, so I mean, but it's more unique. Like I see more unique and interesting things in sci-fi. Like borderline of my thesis, there's more unique and interesting things in sci-fi than there are in fantasy, specifically because sci-fi isn't like, there's not a lot of like general rules with sci-fi like there are with like fantasy.
I think that's because in like the essence of sci-fi is just kind of looking beyond where, but fantasy draws from looking back at what we can already see. So like when you look at a castle and you have this idea of like, oh, that'd be crazy, this, and you see suits of armor because they're literally part of like history to like, us. But with sci-fi, it kind of evolves as we like create things, like AI being a great fear that was kind of popular in the 80s, and now we're kind of seeing it pushed as like a helper, because AI is in everything now. When you Google something or use Facebook or whatever, so where we are technologically, it kind of influences sci-fi writers of like today to kind of improve on that. I think that's why like retro sci-fi books were so crazy, because you're talking about somebody writing a high or like a high, space epic from the 60s when like, TV was just becoming color.
Yeah.
And so they don't really have this frame of reference, but now we have RC cars and drones that go like 100 miles an hour that I could buy from the store, and that's like a toy. And so like that if I gave that to somebody who was writing a sci-fi book in the 60s, they might change their perspective of what they were even writing,
Yeah.
So that kind of like is an interesting look, I think.
Yeah, because I mean, if we're thinking about it, right, is fantasy, you can fall back on history. We had knights, we had all these Templars, we had all these kinds of things back then that we're referencing to for like history wise, and how weaponry and everything was being used, and how we set forth our course, and how things were told back then, dragons and all that stuff, because of old history.
Museum.
Yeah, as in sci-fi, it's futuristic. There is no story there. There's nothing there that can be told besides you coming up with a creative why this is happening, but trying to make it seem more interesting. As in, like I said, back then people had something to reference to. The future is just an open bars kind of thing where you decide what you can do, and hopefully, again, make it as interesting as someone else back then can just have an easier reference.
Yeah, I think the fantasy and sci-fi aspect is how much you would lean on for technology and science. Where in fantasy, it's just like, what is any other alternative that is not like a form of communication that isn't a cell phone? Meanwhile, in a sci-fi, I was like, how do we double down on the idea of a cell phone? It's something that we already have. How would you like improve it? It was like, why talk on a cell phone when you can just like make a hologram or something, or just teleport yourself there?
Yep.
But and the interesting thing about the fantasy, like introducing technology there, is the fact that in the anime Magi, they don't really have technology there. But like at one point, everyone was really low on magic, and then so they couldn't like cast fireballs or anything or fight the enemy. And then one character is just like, I have an idea, and then they made like fire bombs that didn't require any magic at all. I was like, what do you call this type of invention? It was like, I call it technology or science. It's just like, well, like that was actually really interesting. It was like, hey, a way to fight without using any ether or magic or something like that. So it was just like an interesting thing to put a spin on that.
Yeah,
Like,
it's
well,
I got you go.
no, because it was like, as Corey said, I was like, yeah, it's about the past. So it was like, what alternative did they have before finding technology that wasn't in like that wasn't originally in the real world? So like, would magic really be useful if technology actually existed already? So it's like questions like that.
Well, it's funny because weirdly enough, a weird anime that kind of shows what I think is kind of a realistic situation like this is Konosuba. Because, as I said earlier, Kazuma is a fucking loser. He was not, he was sent to this world and has no special powers. He just wants to get money and live the high life. He doesn't want to defeat the Demon King. Fuck that nonsense. So what he does is uses his knowledge of the modern day to create small like trinkets that would be super useful to a fantasy world that yes has magic, but magic is limited to those who can learn it. And so for those people who can't, he like for example, he invents the lighter basically, and it's super impressive to everyone because like, oh, I can make light or fire, like a small fire to like light a campfire, or, like make some light whenever I want to, and I don't need to learn like the enkindle spell or whatever. And he makes bank off of small inventions like that. Whereas just like, and as a joke, he was trying to invent stuff, and he's just like, yeah, I looked up stuff I shouldn't have supposed to back in the real world, so I kind of know how to make TNT. So he was trying to make TNT to sell, and Megumin, who his partner, who basically is like super into explosive magic, he's like, oh, what you making? He's like, oh, I'm making this thing that basically lets you use explosion magic, but anyone can do it. And she fucking destroys it because she's like, how dare you to besmirch the name of fucking explosion magic? I'm not letting you sell this.
I don't remember any of that.
It's it's funny. Well, you don't because it hasn't been in the anime yet.
Oh,
I'm ahead because I've read the light novel. But yeah, it might be in season 3. I actually haven't gotten around to that yet because I'm still watching Fire Force. I'm trying to finish that before I go to watch Konosuba. But Aqua, who's the only other person in this world who understands that Kazuma is from a different world, and she understands that world too. She's like, "Wow, did you really try to invent weapons of mass destruction to sell to these people?" He's like, "What? It's gonna make me money."
No, back in my world, people are already doing it.
Yeah, he's like, "You're lucky I just don't know how to invent guns." But yeah, that was just a small example, kind of piggybacking on what you were saying. But
yeah.
Anyways,
yeah. I mean, I was just again, I've always just been really heavy with the fantasy side, but again, as we have been going in through these conversations, it's kind of actually opened my eyes up a little bit more with sci-fi on how things are being put into play. Because again, it's like you have a lot more things that are going to be considered more of a challenge, but at the same time not, because again, there is more open possibilities. As in fantasy, you're stuck on your planet that you're on, because again, no one really decides that you can leave by spaceship unless that's something of some sort of technology that you find because it was given to you from the future, or some sort of that kind of event that usually never really happens in fantasy. As in the future, again, everything is endless, and there are always ways for you to get around or get away from just the one homing planet or one homing area that you're at, because of the amount of technologies that are available to you. It's just a challenge of trying to figure out how is this going to be moldable to work. Because if I just go off of just what today's standards are with technology that we have now, and then it's not really sci-fi, it's just the current kind of thing that we got going on. We need to do better than that. We need to find ways that are going to improve to make it seem more futuristic than it already is. So this is now where we have to get more creative to make these things come into play to where they work out with what we have, but at the same time it sets us in the right course for being in the future, or at least being in a place where there is more desired events or possibilities that make things more interesting to the reader or to the player.
Yeah, it's like, I guess like it gets my creative juices flowing when I see unique things like that. I really do like them because, again, I'm gonna harp on it. It's the big plus is like the different kind of races of aliens because nothing in Halo looks like anything in Mass Effect looks like anything in space in Warhammer 40k. And I know I've been revolving around those three this entire time, but those are like the big three that stick out in my mind immediately. But it's like just the creative differences between like all the alien races and even like how humans are in each one of those worlds is like crazy different from one another. There's similarities, sure, but whereas like I can point to elves and Dragon Age, elves and like Elder Scrolls and elves and like I don't know The Witcher or something. They're gonna have like a lot of similarities, but there are differences. Before anyone jumps down my throat for people who knows those things intimately, yes, there are differences, but there are more similarities than there are differences a lot of the time. Usually the differences are more subtle.
Well, there's like that's something I just thought about. It's just like how would you put it in a fantasy or sci-fi setting if it's just a person in the real world with superpowers? Like if they got it from space, would it be considered a sci-fi, or if they got it from a different world, like or a different dimension, it would be like fantasy or something like that. Because if you have superpowers in like a different world and you had those superpowers, like the magic, it would be fantasy. But if you got powers from like a chemical plant that give like a reactive thing like Hulk, that is like that, would that be considered sci-fi, or is that specifically like space related? Like Superman.
So
Superman would be sci-fi, maybe.
So I guess I'm trying to understand what you're asking me. So let's just say if I took a space marine and threw him in Middle Earth, are you asking me would that make Lord of the Rings a sci-fi or not?
Yeah. I guess it goes back to me asking to me like saying it's like the technology availability between fantasy and sci-fi. Like he would be considered a superpowered creature in the sci-fi and like the fantasy world because he uses technology as opposed to their regular magic.
I mean, wouldn't that just be a splice of sci-fi fantasy because of things like Highlander exist, right? That these people have been around they're immortals that are like been around for years, but they're fighting in current day kind of thing, and it might take place a little bit more in the future, but they're from the past with magic and stuff, so it would be a weird blend, but it's like sci-fi fantasy, right?
Highlander.
Highlander.
Who's Highlander?
It's
oh my god!
I don't even know how to start this.
How do
I throw myself on my sword?
Basically, there can only be one. There can only be one, and that's all you really need to know. There's a bunch of people, and they're going to cut your head off, and there can only be one of you. So, immortals just having a bad time, unless you're the one winning. But it's a really cool concept.
That's what I said at the beginning. There is a spectrum. If I can go back to bring it back to Fate real quick. I know I'm gonna pick on that, but it's like Fate, especially Grand Order in the mobile game. It's there's time travel, there's flying ships and laser cannons and shit like that. But then half the fucking heroes are running around with spears, swords, arrows, and some of them are running around with guns and lasers, and some of them are fucking robots and some shit. Like, it is just a pure nonsense blend of everything. But it's also all based on a magic system at the same time. So it is like, it's all based, that is a sci-fi fantasy, and you can blend the two of them. Granted, I'm not going to be the one defending Fate. They pull shit out of their ass all the time to explain complete fucking nonsense that happens. But it's just one of those things where, again, like, I'm not, and again, when you said it earlier, Corey, when you're like, well, I don't need this explained to me, I'm cool with this as an audience member. I didn't mean to like pick on you and be like, no, I need explained everything all the time because Fate can do that shit to me, and I'm just like, yeah, I don't need to explain. Fuck it, this is hype right now. Fuck it, let's go. I'm just saying, I typically want that. Very few things I give that a pass to. Me personally, it's usually a personal thing, but you can mix the two, but at that certain point, it usually starts becoming messy in terms of rules. I mean, even
what's
dungeons.
Easier to explain, Zelda or Interstellar?
Zelda, probably, because Zelda at least Zelda doesn't have like widespread magic usage. Because I mean, like, I only see certain individuals. I mean, I'm not well versed in Zelda, but I see only like certain individuals capable of using magic in Zelda. And most of the time, when Link is using it, it's like he buy an item or something. It's not like he learned Fireball.
Yeah, he's not becoming a wizard. You know.
Yeah, you're a wizard, Link.
Yeah, you're a wizard, Link. Yeah.
Yeah, it's so like that's it's almost like a Tolkien thing. It's like magic is very limited and it's not very widely used in Zelda universe, Hyrule world than it is like Dragon Age or something.
Yeah. And the other thing too with fantasy though is like just because we're talking about knights and castles doesn't mean that it's fantasy. That could just be medieval. You know,
Well,
like
like I
because
said before, those are staples.
but I'm
Yeah.
saying like like if when you add magic, I guess is when it starts to become a fantasy or
That's
creatures.
usually the crossing
Yeah,
line, right? Yeah.
because if I were to be like, you know, they're cowboys and that's not a fantasy because it's the past. But if I were like, they're cowboys with magic, then it's like, okay, now this is a fantasy
My
setting.
magic
There
is
you
my
go.
pistol.
There you go. There's a new
Yeah.
game.
But
I cast gun.
Yeah.
the weird part is like anything that takes place with some sort of like futuristic setting, like it's like if you see a timestamp on the screen where it's like 2030, that doesn't necessarily mean it's sci-fi either, but it is going to more likely touch on some sort of like technological supercomputer thing that's military driven or insert geostorm here kind of fucking bullshit where it's like they have a weather controlling gun or
Yeah.
whatever, like James Bond weapons. But James Bond isn't sci-fi. It's just he's a spy and has cool tech nonsense.
He is cool stuff that no one else has.
Yeah.
Effects are
Well,
changes by
here's
technology.
Here's a fun question, right? So there's a great movie that exists called Back to the Future. In Back to the Future, if I remember correctly, we passed
Yeah.
the year that he went to. Like how many years ago at this point? When did that take place? I don't remember off the top of their head.
Wasn't it 2024 or something they was like going to or whatever the hell it was? It's something during COVID I remember circulating.
So
Oh,
either way,
I didn't see this. I didn't see anything past the first one.
well, good. Well, I mean, they're not all terrible movies, but the first one's the best one. Either way, so we passed that year mark, like let's just say 2 years ago, because I don't want to interrupt my train of thought to Google it. So in the movie's interpretation of the future, we had flying cars, or at least hovering cars. Like the cars had no wheels, and same thing with skateboards. And they had all this other kind of like futuristic-ish shit, even though it's all in the retro style. Now, knowing what we know now, if we showed our world to the writer of that movie back then, do you think he would consider our world right now a sci-fi, if nothing else than the fact that we actually have AI now? It's not as not AI like we know Cortana to be in like Halo or something, but just the advances we've made. Like we don't have flying cars, we don't have hovering cars even. But
It was 2015.
Well, it says
oh shit! So we're till 10 years past.
Well, there's
it,
one that says
so,
McFly travels to 2023.
Oh, maybe.
What is the date Marty McFly travels? It's to January 19, 2023.
Okay, well, either way, so 2 years, I guessed right. Let's just say that for an example, anyways.
Yeah.
But like I said, his interpretation of something that's 2 years in our past is way more what we would consider advanced to us now. But would we still be considered sci-fi to him back then? Like looking at our society now, I think
like-
maybe we have self-driving cars and AI, right? So
I think
of
people
covers the simple
heavily
shit.
over heavily estimate like how fast technology or people are willing to let technology advance all at once because just like there's money to be made if they do it slowly.
Technically speaking, we're making advances slower than we did before because we went from colonizing the West to the internet being invented in a century, I believe. So like that's kind of a leap in technology. But like
I mean, technically he's not wrong. We do have flying cars, but they're not practical.
Well, they're not practical, but we have self-driving cars. They're bound by wheels, sure, but those are becoming more common. We have
AI.
we have AI
to generate 100 guys fighting a gorilla meme.
I mean, you fucking show them a television from today compared to their TVs back then, or like show them a Switch. You know, it's like blow their fucking mind, or a phone. All the shit that a phone can do.
I mean, I feel like he would change it for like one of two reasons. Where it's just like it was like it'll be more accurate to people who watch it back then, or it would be like I fucking told you it would be like this, but you should have watched my movie.
I'm not saying like would he change it. I'm saying like if we were able to time travel back and show him like our world, like, would he consider us like, is that like, he's like, oh, I can see that as a sci-fi future, like that's considered a sci-fi future to them back then, even though it's not what he interpreted of it as originally, you know?
Yeah, like somebody in the '80s looking at. I mean, they've massively disappointed. Thought a lot of things were going to come from the future and kill them, but it's like, is it sci-fi? Well, I don't know. I mean, it's just better versions of the things that they interact with now, like better telephones. I guess you could make that argument with like transporters versus like a car.
I
But-
mean, I guess it would be considered. They could consider it sci-fi, though. For like entertainment reasons, it would. I feel like they go the route that they do because they have to exaggerate it for entertainment purposes.
Actually, I would consider it sci-fi because we have battle bots.
Yeah, we have
So,
battle bots.
We literally have robots that fight each other in arena, and they didn't really have
Yeah.
that. So there we go.
I wanted to bring it back because I remember I wanted to say something earlier when Jordan brought up SCP. The fun thing about SCP is that SCP is actually fantasy sci-fi. It is a mix of the two because, while generally speaking, a lot of the more popular SCP articles are sci-fi based with like crazy monsters and stuff. Thermatology, which is just the scientific term for magic, is very much a very like well utilized thing in SCP. There are articles that say it's thermatology, it's magic, fucking who cares. But that's almost the point of SCP though, is that we're trying to understand the ununderstandable, or like something that we just simply do not understand. It's specifically the point is that we don't understand how it works. So shrugging your shoulders and saying it's magic is acceptable. Plus, not only that, SCP isn't constrained by lore or like canon or anything. So people just have like this loose framework of a secretive underground organization that tackles things that we wouldn't consider normal or real in our world and trying to contain and understand them. Not
Is that understandable?
not to take anything. I mean, well, in a basic concept, yes, not deeply though. That's a basic framework. And it's not to take away from Jordan's point. There's still plenty. I would say there is more usage of sci-fi elements in SCP than there are fantasy. But what I'm saying is that like SCP is a jumping off point for both. But at the same time, I've seen crazy cool interpretations of magic and more fantasy-like settings and things in SCP than I would say in like a fantasy video game with just elves and dwarves and stuff. So it's a mixture of both.
I guess you could consider, because like kind of gotten to there's like anything in like the future, if it's like technology is more advanced as opposed to fantasy relying on magic as more than technology, if any, and like Konosuba, whereas like technology could be considered a type of magic, because you can well, I guess it would be science is a type of magic, because it's the main category to technology, because you can use it to manipulate and do harm and do health, heal, curing, all that. So it's
health.
I'm
Do the do.
I mean, is it? Yeah, because it's like
The doctor comes up to you. I'm about to do health to you.
Yeah,
Please don't. Not behind this.
Don't do me.
yeah, but it's like magic is just like a more like non-physical type of technology, because like even like in Harry Potter, it's like it's very like the way they use magic is very practical. It was like, what do we use technology for? It's like in more practical usage of everyday life. So it's like I would consider like sci-fi to be technological fantasy, as opposed to a fantasy being a non-technological fantasy.
Well, a lot of I think that brings back to what we were saying at the beginning, is that sci-fi likes to explain a lot of its stuff using either realist or like scientific or like pseudo-scientific terms. I know what you're talking about because there's a example like D&D, Dungeons and Dragons mixes a lot of sci-fi and fantasy elements. You can literally play as a Warforged, which is a fucking machine with a soul. You can play as a robot. And there's guns in D&D. Again, you can, D&D is so widely malleable. Some of this isn't, depending on what you're doing and playing, it isn't true or not. But I see a lot of fantasy places like, essentially, like, let's just say, like, instead of creating a combustible engine, you have an engine, but it runs on fire magic. It's like technology where its running power source is magic, you know. So that's an interesting like take on that sort of thing. D&D seems to do that a lot. Or like, you know, a refrigerator that doesn't make cold air based on a bunch of, you know, wires and, you know, coolant and whatnot. It's a refrigerator with like a magic ice rock in it, or that makes it cold. You know, it's a combination of the two. You can see that sometimes, and that's interesting.
Kind of how Final Fantasy approaches magic with the crystals, and the crystals are elements that kind of bring that magic into the world.
Yeah, so I mean, again, like I said at the beginning, it's a spectrum. Not everything applies to everything else. There's just broad strokes that you can't apply to both sides of it. I just think at the end of the day, I prefer giving sci-fi a chance because I feel like I have a higher chance of finding something bad, but if it's not bad, it's a higher chance of being something like exceptional, if that makes any sense. Whereas like fantasy, I have a lower chance of finding something bad, but a higher chance of finding something like average, you know, that's just like okay, acceptable, but nothing like extraordinary, you know. That's what I think. Something personally cool to me that would get my creative juices like flowing or interested compared to the two of them. So
Nice. Anything else we got before we close out today?
I think I'm good. I have said my piece.
Yep. Yep.
We'll probably come back and touch on this a little bit more. in the
Definitely.
future, too.
That was a really good topic.
I win.
Yeah.
In the sci-fi future.
Exactly.
Yeah, in the sci-fi future.
All right. Well, I guess we'll be wrapping up today. Don't forget to follow us on Spotify, Twitter, YouTube, and our Rumble channel so you never miss an episode. And for all you gamers out there, just remember to keep exploring, keep playing, keep listening. Until next time, this is the Mediocre Rumble Brothers podcast signing off. Thanks for listening.
Hey, this is Corey, and thanks for checking out Mediocre Rumble Brothers. If you liked the video, please drop a like, and if you didn't, that's fine too. If you'd like us to talk about any specific games, drop a comment below, or feel free to discuss your experience with the games that we've mentioned in the episode. You can also listen to our episodes prior to YouTube on our Spotify. Thanks for watching, and hope to see you again soon.